I cut my father out of the will meeting. He said he understood. His lawyer didn't. The room we used for the meeting wasn't the boardroom. That was the first decision, and I made it on purpose. The boardroom had his name on a brass plate outside it, Walter Voss, founder, and I didn't want him signing anything under his own name on the wall. So I booked the smaller conference room down the hall, the one we used for vendor calls, with the round table that seats 6 and the whiteboard nobody ever erases properly. I told myself it was neutral ground. I told myself a lot of things that month. It was a Tuesday in October, 10 in the morning, the kind of gray Pittsburgh sky that makes the fluorescent lights in a windowless conference room feel less like a compromise and more like the natural order of things. There was a pot of coffee on the credenza that nobody touched. I remember that detail specifically because I'd asked Doreen to have it ready. A small, hospitable gesture I now recognize as the kind of thing you do when you want a room to feel less like what it actually is. Our attorney, a trust and estates man named Halloran who'd done work for us twice before, laid out 3 folders on the table. One for me, one for my father, one for himself. He walked through it the way lawyers walk through things they've done 100 times. Flat. Procedural. No weight on any single sentence. The restructured trust would name me as sole trustee. My father would remain a beneficiary, fully provided for, but he would no longer hold a vote on distributions, on the sale of company assets, on anything requiring trustee discretion. Halloran used the phrase, streamlining decision authority. I remember thinking it was a good phrase. Clean, defensible, my father sat across from me in a golf polo, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he didn't reach for the folder right away. He let it sit closed in front of him for a moment, the way he used to let a supplier's quote sit on his desk before he'd tell you whether the number was fair. Then he opened it, read for longer than I expected, and signed where Halloran's finger indicated. 3 signatures. No questions. If that's what needs to happen, he said, capping the pen, I understand. That was it. That was the whole reaction. I remember feeling, in that moment, a kind of relief so complete it almost embarrassed me. Relief that he wasn't going to make this hard. Relief that 74 years of a man who built something out of nothing had apparently reached the point where he just let it go. I read his calm as surrender. It would be 18 months before I understood it was the opposite of that, and by the time I understood, it was his lawyer on the phone, not mine, walking me through exactly how much I hadn't known. My name is David Voss. I'm 44. I live in Pittsburgh, about 6 miles from the house I grew up in, and until 3 years ago I was the chief financial officer of Voss Industrial Supply, a company my father started in 1979 out of a rented warehouse off Route 51. Today I run it. I have the title, the office, the parking spot closest to the door. I want to walk through exactly how this happened, in the order it happened. Because I've noticed that when I tell this story out of order, people hear the wrong version of it. They hear either a villain or a martyr. And I was neither. I was a son who did the math on his father's decline before his father had actually declined. And I want you to sit with that distinction. Because it's the whole story. I should say, before I go further, that I'm not a man who tells stories about himself easily. I spent 20 years in finance learning to strip the feeling out of a sentence before it leaves the room. You don't walk into a bank asking for a credit line and lead with how nervous the last quarter made you. That habit followed me home. It followed me into this. So if this account sounds more like a set of minutes than a confession in places, that's not distance from what happened. It's the only register I have for something this large. I've found, in the writing of it, that the control is the only way I can get through it without the sentences running away from me entirely. My father built Voss Industrial Supply on a single insight, that the steel and chemical processing plants along the Mon Valley needed a supplier who could get specialty valve fittings to a job site inside 48 hours, instead of the standard 2-week lead time the big distributors ran on. He mortgaged the house to buy the first inventory. My mother, who passed when I was 26, used to say that in the first 3 years he slept more nights on the office cot than in his own bed. By the time I was in high school, Voss Industrial had 4 locations across western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, And by the time I graduated business school, it was doing 60 million a year in a niche most people have never heard of and never will. The detail about my father that mattered, the one that would matter again later, though I didn't know it yet, was this. He never signed anything he hadn't read twice, and he never let anyone in the room believe he'd only read it once. Vendors used to joke about it. They'd bring him a contract expecting a rubber stamp because he was affable, because he shook your hand and asked about your kids. And then he'd hand it back with 3 clauses circled in pencil and a question about each one. "I like to know what I'm agreeing to," he'd say, even when I already know I'm going to agree to it. People underestimated him constantly, in exactly this way for 40 years. I watched it happen my entire childhood. And then, at 39, sitting across a conference table from him with my own attorney's folders in front of us, I did it too. I want to be honest about that rather than dress it up. I have a specific memory of the habit, from when I was maybe 14, riding along on a Saturday to a supplier's office in Beaver Falls, because my mother needed the house quiet for a bridge club afternoon, and my father needed somewhere to put me. The supplier, a big genial man named Costa who ran a fittings manufacturer, slid a 5-year exclusivity agreement across the desk with the confidence of someone who assumed a handshake and a plate of cannoli would close it. My father read it once, slowly, then read it a second time out loud, under his breath, stopping twice to ask what a specific term meant in practice rather than on paper. Costa's smile got tighter each time. In the car afterward, I asked my father why he'd bothered reading it twice when he'd clearly already decided to sign it. "Reading it once tells you what it says," he told me. "Reading it twice tells you what they hope you won't notice it says." I didn't think about that sentence again for almost 30 years. I thought about it constantly in the months after Ferris's office. By the time I came up through the company, first summers in the warehouse stacking inventory, then a real job in purchasing after business school, then finance, then the CFO title at 34, Voss Industrial had become the kind of business people in the Valley pointed to when they wanted to explain how a family operation could out-execute a national distributor. My father never took an outside investor. He never took on debt he couldn't retire within 5 years. He turned down 2 acquisition offers in the 2000s that would have made him wealthy on paper and, in his words, made somebody else's decisions for the next 20 years. And both of those companies that acquired his competitors were gone within a decade, absorbed and hollowed out by the private equity firms that bought them. He was right more often than he was wrong, and he was quiet about being right, which I think is a different skill than being right in the first place, and one I hadn't yet learned. My mother's death, when I was 26, changed something in him that he never described to me directly, though Claire and I used to compare notes on it. He stopped taking vacations. He started coming in earlier. He kept my mother's coffee mug on the shelf in his office, not out of any visible sentiment, just there, unremarked upon. The way he kept the workbench in the garage he never finished sanding. If you asked him how he was doing, 3 years out or 10 years out, he'd say keeping busy and change the subject to the Youngstown market or a supplier's pricing. I used to read that as a man who'd simply moved past it, efficiently, the way he moved past everything. It occurs to me now, writing this out in order, that I had a habit of reading my father's silence as the absence of something, when in every instance I can now recall, it was actually the presence of something he'd decided wasn't mine to carry. My justification, at the time, felt airtight. My father had turned 72. He'd had a mild cardiac event 2 years earlier. Nothing catastrophic. A stent. A changed diet. 6 months of my mother's old worry transferred onto me, and in the year after it, I noticed him repeating stories in meetings, losing a beat in negotiations he used to win outright, deferring decisions he would once have made in the room. I told myself I was protecting the company. I told myself that a $60 million business couldn't run on sentiment, that somebody in the family had to be willing to make the hard call before a crisis forced a worse one, and that the fact I was willing to make it was a kind of loyalty rather than its absence. My wife Renata didn't see it that way, and she was the only person in my life who said so out loud before I did it. The act itself, the will meeting, as I've come to call it, though it wasn't a will at all, but a restructuring of the Voss family trust. Took 3 weeks to prepare and 11 minutes to execute. I'd approached Halloran alone, without telling my father I was doing it, and told him I wanted language that preserved my father's income and lifestyle completely, while removing his discretionary authority over the trust's controlling stake in the company. Halloran, to his credit, asked me twice if my father had given any indication he wanted this. I told him no, that this was a protective measure I was taking on my father's behalf, and Halloran, being paid by me, drafted what I asked for. My sister Claire flew in from Chicago for the meeting, and she was the one whose face I remember more clearly than my father's, because hers did what I expected my father's to do. She sat 2 seats down from him, arms crossed, and when Halloran finished the summary, she said, "Dad, you don't have to sign this today," in a voice that had an edge in it I hadn't heard from her since we were teenagers. My father looked at her, not at me, and said, "It's all right, Claire." Then he looked at the folder and signed it. The way I already told you, no drama, no argument, no request for time. Before the pens were even capped, Claire pulled me into the hallway outside the conference room, while Halloran packed his folders and my father sat alone at the table, looking, I noted at the time, entirely unbothered. "You didn't even give him a night to think about it," she said. "You had a lawyer he's never worked with before hand him a document and you watched him sign it in the same room." I told her Halloran had been thorough, that Dad had every opportunity to ask questions, that nobody had rushed him. "He doesn't ask questions when he's decided the fight isn't worth having," Claire said. "That's not the same as understanding it." I remember being irritated with her more than I was troubled by what she'd said, because I'd spent 3 weeks convincing myself this was the responsible move, and I didn't have room, that afternoon, for the possibility that responsible and correct weren't the same thing. I went back into the room to shake Halloran's hand and found my father still seated, turning his own copy of the trust document over once, checking, I assumed, that all 3 signature pages were there. "You all right, Dad?" I asked, mostly out of the reflexive courtesy you offer someone you've just watched sign away authority, not because I expected the answer to be complicated. He closed the folder and looked at me for a second longer than the question required. "I'm fine, David," he said. "You go on and get this filed. No sense letting it sit." That last part struck me, briefly, as strange. A man handing over control of his own trust, telling me not to let the paperwork sit, but I filed it under efficiency. The same instinct that had made him a good businessman for 40 years, and didn't examine it further. I told myself, walking out to my car that afternoon, that Claire's discomfort was the emotional reaction and my father's calm was the rational one, and that between the two I'd clearly gotten the read right, because the person actually affected wasn't upset. I didn't consider, not once in 18 months, that a man who never signed anything he hadn't read twice might have read this document exactly as carefully as everything else in his life, and simply chosen not to show me what he found in it. The 18 months that followed were, from where I was standing, the best stretch the company had ever had. Revenue was up 11% the first year under the new authority structure, largely because I could move on acquisition opportunities without walking every decision through a 72-year-old man who wanted 3 days to think about a number I could evaluate in an afternoon. We opened a 5th location in Youngstown. I hired a VP of operations I'd wanted to bring on for 2 years and never could get my father to approve. Renata and I finished the addition on the house. My son started travel hockey. Life, in the specific and narrow sense of a household running well, proceeded as though the matter of my father's authority had been settled cleanly and permanently, and I let myself believe that. My father kept coming into the office 3 days a week, which surprised me a little, though I read it as habit rather than anything else. A man who didn't know what to do with himself if he wasn't near the warehouse floor. He kept his old office, though I'd quietly moved the executive parking sign to reflect me instead of him. A small thing I'm not proud of mentioning, but I said I'd walk through this in order, and that means the small things too. He was cordial. He asked good questions in meetings he still attended. Twice a month or so he'd disappear for a few hours in the middle of the day, and when I asked his assistant Doreen where he'd gone, she'd say only that he had a personal appointment, in a tone that discouraged follow-up. I assumed it was medical. I never asked him directly. There were 3 things, in that stretch, that I noticed and dismissed, and I want to name them exactly because, in hindsight, none of them were noise. The first was a document. About 4 months after the trust meeting, I was going through old filing boxes in the warehouse office looking for a decade-old vendor contract, and I found a manila folder labeled, in my father's handwriting, Voss Holdings B-Class. I didn't recognize the designation. I assumed it was an old dead entity from before I joined the company. Some shell my father had set up in the 80s for tax purposes and never dissolved. I put it back. I didn't open it. The second was a name. My father mentioned, in passing, over a Sunday dinner about 10 months in, that he'd had lunch with Ferris. I asked who that was, and he said, old friend, does some legal work, and moved the conversation along to my son's hockey season. I didn't press. I had no reason to think the name mattered. The third was smaller than the other 2, almost nothing. My father started asking me, every few weeks, some version of the same question, how the Youngstown location was performing against its original projections, specifically against the projections, not the actuals in isolation. I remember thinking it was sweet, actually. A founder still keeping score on the numbers even after he'd handed off the authority to keep score officially. I answered him honestly every time. I had no reason not to. I didn't understand, until much later, that he was building a record, month by month, of exactly how the decisions I'd made without him were performing against the decisions I claimed justified taking the authority away from him in the first place. There was a 4th detail I didn't count at the time because it didn't feel like a detail at all. It felt like ordinary life. My father started attending my son Cole's hockey games with a consistency he hadn't managed even when I was a kid playing the same sport at the same rink. He'd sit 2 rows behind the glass, alone, in a Voss industrial windbreaker that was older than Cole, and afterward he'd take Cole for pancakes at the diner on Route 30 without inviting me, which I read, generously, as a grandfather wanting time alone with his grandson. It wasn't until much later that I understood those Saturday mornings had another function entirely, that in a family where the men communicate through action rather than confrontation, my father had chosen to keep the one relationship in the family structure that had nothing to do with the trust, nothing to do with the company, nothing I could restructure or take a vote on, and to invest in it deliberately while everything else between us went quiet. I also remember that first winter after the trust meeting, a Christmas Eve where my father gave Renata a small wrapped box that turned out to be a set of cufflinks that had belonged to his own father, a man neither of us had ever met, dead before I was born. He didn't make a speech about it. He said only, these should stay in the family, and you 2 are as much the family as anyone, and moved on to help Cole put together a model kit at the kitchen table. Renata mentioned to me afterward, quietly, that it felt like the kind of gift a man gives when he's thinking about what he wants to pass down and to whom. And I told her she was reading too much into a Christmas present. I think about that conversation more than almost any other from that year. There was one more evening from that stretch I've turned over since, though at the time it registered as nothing more than a pleasant surprise. It was late January, a little over a year after the trust meeting, and my father asked if he could take Renata and me to dinner at the old Italian place on Butler Street where he used to close deals in the 80s. He ordered a bottle of wine he clearly already knew the price of, and over the meal he asked, unprompted, detailed questions about the Youngstown acquisition financing, not skeptical questions, just precise ones, the kind that assume real fluency in the numbers rather than a general interest in how his son was doing. Renata caught my eye across the table at one point, and I read the look as pride, and I let myself feel good about that for the rest of the night. I understand now that what she may actually have caught was a man conducting due diligence over antipasto, gathering, one dinner at a time, the record he'd eventually hand to Ferris. The call came on a Tuesday in March, 18 months and 11 days after the trust meeting. I know the exact span because it would come up again, later, in a room where the exact span mattered. I was in my office reviewing a supplier contract when Doreen buzzed through and said there was a Mr. Ferris on the line, an attorney, asking for me specifically. I almost had her take a message. I took the call instead, mostly out of idle curiosity about the name my father had mentioned 9 months earlier. Ferris introduced himself as Thomas Ferris, of Ferris and Whitcomb, and said he represented Walter Voss. Represented him, present tense, ongoing, in a matter concerning the Voss family trust. I told him I wasn't aware my father had independent counsel. Our family used Halloran for everything. Ferris said, evenly, Mr. Voss retained our firm 2 years ago, before the restructuring meeting you attended in October of last year. Before, I remember the word landing in my chest before I understood why. He asked if I could come to his office the following week, with my own counsel present, to discuss what he called a matter of trust administration that predates the current structure. I asked him to just tell me now. He declined, politely, and said it would be better handled in person, with documents in front of us. I hung up and sat in my office for close to 20 minutes before I called Halloran, and Halloran, when I explained what I'd been told, went quiet in a way lawyers don't go quiet unless something has genuinely surprised them. The meeting, when it happened, was in Ferris's office on the 11th floor of a building downtown I'd walked past 1,000 times without knowing my father had a relationship with anyone in it. My father was there. Halloran was there, sitting slightly apart from me, which I noticed and understood immediately. Ferris opened a folder, a different folder than Halloran's, thicker and laid out, in the same flat procedural voice Halloran had used 18 months earlier, exactly what I had not known. 2 years before the trust meeting I orchestrated, before I'd even begun drafting language with Halloran, my father had gone to Ferris and executed what's called a springing power of attorney with an independent capacity clause, a legal instrument that, in the event anyone attempted to restructure his authority on the basis of diminished capacity, required an independent medical and cognitive evaluation before any such restructuring could take legal effect. He'd also created the B-class holding entity I'd found in that manila folder 8 months earlier, not a dead shell from the 80s, but a live structure, established the same year. That held a minority but legally decisive block of Voss Industrial's voting shares outside the family trust entirely. My restructuring of the trust, the meeting where he'd signed without argument, had transferred authority over the majority position. It had never touched, could never touch, the B-class block, because he'd moved it somewhere I hadn't thought to look, because I hadn't known there was anywhere to look. He had the evaluation done privately, Ferris said, sliding a document across the table. 11 months ago. A neuropsychological assessment, full battery, from a specialist at UpMC. The results are in your father's file, David, and I'll tell you plainly what they say, because he's given me permission to. He passed every measure at or above the range for his age and education level. There is no diminished capacity. There never was. I looked at the document, at the letterhead, at a signature line from a physician I'd never heard of, and asked the question that mattered more to me in that moment than anything else on the table, why he'd let me believe, for 18 months, in a version of him that didn't exist. Ferris answered that one, since it was really a legal question dressed as a personal one. The independent capacity clause was never triggered because your restructuring never formally alleged diminished capacity on paper, he said. You didn't put it in writing. You acted on an assumption and had your attorney draft language that avoided stating it outright, which, frankly, is why Mr. Halloran never had cause to ask for an evaluation himself. Your father knew that. He'd read the restructuring document the same afternoon you presented it, and he understood exactly what it did and didn't say. That detail landed harder than the neuropsych report in some ways, because it meant my father hadn't just outmaneuvered me with a document I didn't know existed. He'd read my own document more carefully than I had, understood precisely what legal ground I had and hadn't stood on, and let me walk forward on it anyway. Halloran, beside me, had gone very still. I never asked you to state a capacity finding, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. You told me it was precautionary. I drafted precautionary language. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man realizing, in real time, that he'd been an honest instrument in something he hadn't fully understood. Ferris slid a second document across, a one-page summary dated 18 months earlier, the same week as the trust meeting. It was a memo my father had dictated to Ferris the day after signing, laying out, in plain language, exactly what I'd attempted to do, exactly what legal protections he already had in place that made it unenforceable against the B-class position, and a single instruction: take no action, observe, report back, only if I asked. He didn't want to stop you, Ferris said. He wanted to know if you'd tell him the truth eventually, on your own, without being forced to. That's what the memo says, more or less word for word. I read it twice, the way he'd have wanted me to. I asked, and I remember my voice sounding strange to me, flatter than I meant it to be, why he'd had the evaluation done if he wasn't going to use it. Why he'd sat in that conference room and signed the trust restructuring instead of stopping it cold with a document that would have ended the conversation in 30 seconds. My father answered that question himself. He hadn't said much since we'd sat down. He said, "Because you needed to find out you were wrong on your own, David, not because I told you. I want to be precise about what that document actually did, because the mechanics matter, and I've come to think the mechanics are the whole point." The B-class shares meant my father had retained the entire time a legal veto over any sale of the company or any action that would fundamentally alter its structure, the very authority I believed I'd consolidated for good in that conference room 18 months earlier. He had let me run the company. He had let me make real decisions, take real risks, open Youngstown, hire the VP I wanted. He had not, for one single day in that 18 months, actually been without power. He had simply chosen not to use it, and chosen not to tell me he still had it. Because, and this is the part that took me weeks to sit with rather than argue against, he wanted to see what I would do with authority I believed was entirely mine. And he wanted to see it without the shadow of his oversight changing how I behaved. Ferris also told me, almost as an aside, that the lunches with Ferris my father had mentioned at Sunday dinner weren't legal strategy sessions in the dramatic sense I might now imagine. Half of them were just lunch. Ferris had known my father for 30 years, back to a shared parish council. My father hadn't built some elaborate trap. He'd protected himself, quietly and legally, the way he'd read every contract twice for 40 years, and then he'd let the rest of it play out, because he wanted to know something about his son that a lawsuit or a confrontation would never have told him. I misjudged my father's capability. I want to say that plainly, without dressing it in more feeling than it needs, because feeling isn't what the moment actually contained. I sat in Ferris's office and understood, in the space of about 4 minutes, that the man I had voted out of decision-making authority because I believed he'd slowed down had, in that same window, outmaneuvered me legally in a way I hadn't detected for a year and a half. That's not a feeling. That's an operating fact I had wrong, in a business I run for a living, about a person I'd known my entire life. I drove home from Ferris's office that first evening and sat in the driveway for a long time before going inside, running the 18 months back through my head in the new light of what I now knew. Every decision I'd made, Youngstown, the VP hire, the 2 acquisitions I'd closed without walking them past him, I had made believing I was operating with authority I'd taken cleanly and permanently. I now understood I'd been operating the entire time inside a perimeter my father had quietly drawn around me, close enough that I never bumped it, wide enough that I never noticed it was there. That's a strange thing to sit with as a business person. I run a company. I evaluate risk and control for a living. I had missed, for a year and a half, that the largest single variable in my own operating environment was a decision my father had made and not told me about. The second thing took longer to land, and it landed after the first one, which I think is the order it's supposed to happen in. My father's restraint, the calm in the conference room, the 18 months of silence, the lunches he never explained, wasn't passivity. And it wasn't a weapon he was holding in reserve either. Not really. Not in the way I might have described it to Renata that first week when I was still furious at myself and needed somewhere to put it. It was closer to something like faith. He had the leverage to stop me cold the day I tried it, and the leverage to expose me publicly, to Claire, to the board, to Halloran. at any point in 18 months, and he used none of it. He let me become, for a year and a half, the man I'd decided he no longer had the capacity to be. And when the reckoning came, he didn't deliver it himself. He let Ferris deliver the facts, and he sat there mostly silent, and the only thing he said to me directly, in that entire meeting, was the one sentence about needing to find out on my own. Renata asked me, that night, whether I was angry at him, and I told her the honest answer, which surprised me as I said it out loud. I wasn't. I'd expected to be. I'd braced for it in the car on the way home, the way you brace for a diagnosis. What I actually felt was closer to the specific, quiet humiliation of realizing you've spent 18 months mistaking someone's patience for their limitation, and understanding that the correction for that isn't an argument, it's a changed way of paying attention going forward. I didn't call Claire that night to tell her she'd been right in the hallway outside the conference room. I called her 3 days later, after I'd been to the garage, because by then I had something more than an admission to offer her. I had an account of what I intended to do about it, and she deserved that more than an apology. I drove to his house 3 days later. Not the office, the house, which felt important, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. He was in the garage, which is where he goes when he wants to be doing something with his hands while he's actually thinking about something else, refinishing an old workbench he'd built decades earlier and never gotten around to sanding down properly. I stood in the doorway for a while before he noticed me. I owe you an accounting, I said. Not an apology first. An accounting. I want you to hear what I understood and when, so you know I'm not guessing at what I did. He set down the sandpaper. Go ahead. I told him everything. The timeline, the conversation with Halloran, my read of Claire's reaction versus his, the acquisitions I'd made in the 18 months as though I were finally free to make them. All of it. He listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of statement. Because interrupting isn't something my father does when he's already decided what he thinks and is waiting to see if you'll get there yourself. When I finished, he said, I knew you'd tell me eventually. I didn't know if you'd tell me everything. He picked the sandpaper back up. You told me everything. That matters more than you think it does right now. I asked him why he hadn't just stopped it in the room that first day, with the evaluation already sitting in a file 11 months before the meeting even happened. Because stopping you would have proven you wrong about my capacity, he said, and it wouldn't have proven anything about yours. I already knew what I was capable of. I didn't know what you were. That's the whole scene. I've thought about it more than any conversation I've had with anyone in my adult life, and it's 4 sentences long. The repair I've made isn't a single gesture, because I don't think a single gesture would have meant anything to a man who doesn't operate that way, and it wouldn't have been honest to who I actually am either. The first thing I did, within a week of that conversation, was go back to Halloran and, with my father and Ferris both in the room this time, restructure the trust a second time. Not to restore some symbolic authority my father had never actually lost, since the B-class shares meant he'd held real power the entire time, but to formally reinstate him as co-trustee of the majority position, with a joint consent requirement on any acquisition or divestiture above a threshold we set together. It's not ceremonial. 2 acquisitions have gone through that clause since, and on one of them he said no, flatly, over a due diligence issue I'd missed. And he was right, and the deal died, and I was glad it did. The second thing was smaller and, I think, mattered to him more, though he'd never say so directly. I moved his name back onto the boardroom door, not the brass plate, which had never come down, but the working designation, founder's office, on the room I'd quietly repurposed as a general conference space. I asked him to keep an office there, not as a courtesy but as a functioning part of how the company runs. And I started routing him into new vendor negotiations again, the ones where his read on a contract is still, honestly, better than mine. He accepted both, but not instantly and not effusively. He took 2 weeks to review the revised trust language before signing it. Reading it twice, the way he reads everything, and when he signed it he said only, "This is fair," which from him is a considerable statement. There wasn't a scene where he told me he forgave me. I don't think that scene is coming, and I've stopped waiting for it. because I understand now that his form of forgiveness was already delivered 18 months before I even knew I needed it. In the form of every day he could have exposed me and chose not to. There was a third thing, smaller than the trust language and the office, that I didn't plan as carefully but that has mattered more than I expected. I stopped introducing him at industry events and supplier dinners as my father, who used to run the place. I started introducing him the way he'd always deserved to be introduced. The way I'd stopped doing sometime in that 18-month stretch without fully noticing I'd stopped, Walter Voss, who built this company and who I still bring the hard decisions to. He doesn't correct it or wave it off anymore the way he used to when I got the introduction closer to right by accident. He just shakes the hand that's offered and lets the sentence stand. Claire told me, a few months in, that it was the first time since the trust meeting she'd seen him look, in a room full of people, entirely like himself. Halloran and I still work together, though differently than before. He asked me, a few weeks after the second restructuring, whether he should have pushed harder when he'd asked me twice if my father had wanted the original changes. I told him no, that the failure wasn't in his diligence, it was in mine, and that a lawyer can only draft what his client is honest with him about. I've since made a habit, in every major decision involving my father's interests, of having him in the room for the drafting conversation itself, not just the signing. It's slower. It's also, I've found, the only version of fast that actually holds. Here's what I've come to think, turning this over the way he taught me to turn over a contract before I sign it. Pride doesn't usually look like arrogance from the inside. It looks like competence. It looks like being the person willing to make the hard call, the person efficient enough to streamline what everyone else is too sentimental to touch. I was so certain that my father's calm in that conference room was surrender that I never once considered it might be the most controlled decision of his entire career, a man choosing, deliberately, to let his son find the floor of his own judgment rather than being handed the answer. Underestimating someone doesn't feel like an insult when you're doing it. It feels like clarity. That's what makes it dangerous, and that's what cost me 18 months I can't get back, even though, by every measure that matters, I got them back anyway, because he made sure I would. I still keep his father's cufflinks in mind more than I probably should, the ones he gave Renata that Christmas, the ones he said should stay in the family. I understand now that a man like my father doesn't tell you what he's protecting. He shows you, once in a gesture small enough to miss, and then he waits to see if you were paying attention. I wasn't, for a long time. I'm trying to be now. That's not a resolution so much as a discipline, and I suspect it's the only kind of resolution a man like him would respect in the first place. Not a single grand correction, but the ordinary, repeated act of paying closer attention than you did the last time. He still comes in 3 days a week. He still reads everything twice. Last month he circled a clause in a supplier renewal I'd have signed without a second look, and he was right to, and I told him so, and he nodded once and moved on to the next page. Because that's the whole exchange, that's as far as the sentence needs to go between us. I used to think that was distance. I've come to understand it's just how the men in this family have always said the important things, not in the sentence itself, but in the fact that you were standing there long enough to hear it. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more measured, honest stories.